If you were to ask Dana White back then what the UFC needed to put them to a level unlike anything we've ever seen to compare them to the four major sports, it would have been a reality TV show that him and his high school friends Lorenzo and Frank Fertitta would create at a time in which reality TV was at an all-time high. Every show that made people famous was on reality TV, late night television, daytime television, you name it, it was on. Nearly 59% of reality TV views watched to see drama or conflict. Almost 36% of Americans consider reality TV their favorite genre. Real Housewives franchise has attracted over 1.6 billion viewers worldwide, and the Kardashians have made over 100 million from their reality TV shows.
You guys had to pay the production cost for that, and I read somewhere there was like $10 million, and that ended up being a huge hit. How did that transform the business?
So we were talking to all the different networks. None of them liked it. Everybody was terrified of this thing. It was so big at the time. It was like our Trojan horse to get on TV, with fighting without it actually being fighting. And so we were pitching all the networks. Nobody liked it. So this new network popped up called Spike TV, and they were labeled the network for men. I mean, if we don't fit there, where do we fit? So we go and meet with these guys, and they don't like the idea. They couldn't get out of the room fast enough with us. They were headed to a Dodgers game. And it was going to cost like $10 million to produce the show. And the Fertitta brothers said, what if we put up the $10 million? They liked that idea a lot better.
The coaches for this crazy idea were none other than Randy Couture and Chuck Liddell, two of the most recognizable faces in the UFC at that time. But this was more than a reality TV show. This was a true insight of what it was like to be a fighter, especially when UFC was relatively new at that time. What it took to weight cut and make weight at that certain specific weight class that a fighter fought at. What it took to make fights. You didn't pick and choose, you had to win a challenge in order to have control of who you fought. It also introduced crazy characters like Diego Sanchez, who implemented yoga into his pre-fight ritual, and probably the craziest character in tough history, Chris Lieben.
Chris Lieben decides to urinate on his pillow. Is he coming?
Also, this was probably the first time in pugilistic history that two fighters ever fought over asparagus.
It's stupid. You know what asparagus is.
I do know what asparagus is now.
You get it by now. The show is called The Ultimate Fighter, and the first few episodes that aired on Spike TV were basically showing that these fighters would eat, sleep, and train the sport of mixed martial arts. They would live together. They would sleep in the same rooms as one another. They would cook for one another. They would do the dishes. And then they would go and train for twice a day, 2 hours each training session. So it was quite frowned upon when the fighters really realized that they're going to have to be fighting each other. Possible teammates, possible friends, and for sure, your own roommate. Which led Dana White to drop probably the coldest speech, pre-fight pep talk we have ever seen in reality TV history.
Does anybody here not want to fight? Did anybody come here thinking that they would not fight?
Some of us thought we weren't going to fight till the finals. That was my understanding as well.
Do you want to be a fighter? That's the question.
That's why I'm here.
It's not about living in a house. It's about, do you want to be a fighter? And only you know that. Anybody who says they don't, I don't want you here. And I'll throw you the out of this gym so fast your head will spin.
With that speech led some chaotic events that happened in the house. Josh Koscheck, who's probably one of the biggest pricks in UFC history, and Bobby Southworth, who probably had one of the most craziest things to happen not only in Ultimate Fighter history but reality TV history, as they sprayed Chris Lieben, the biggest loudmouth in the house, with the water hose, causing him to go on a full-on rampage, tearing up the house that was paid for by the UFC.
You know what? The show's over because I'll go to jail living with that mother.
Another crazy character to come for this, and personally for me, the man that got me into the sport, Forrest Griffin. Think about it, these guys were basically isolated from the outside world. They literally could not read magazines. They couldn't call their families. They couldn't call their girlfriends. You just eat, sleep, train, probably beat your meat a few times. That's it. The first season of The Ultimate Fighter aired on Spike TV and on average had 1.3 million viewers per episode.
You guys saw something like tripled your guys' revenue, like 2005 to 2006. Like the business kind of took off from there.
Took off. And it wasn't like this. It was like a rocket ship.
If you think Tough One produced a lot of great fighters, Forrest Griffin, Diego Sanchez, Chris Lieben, Kenny Florian, Josh Koscheck. And yes, the show would go on to produce many champions after this. And as the fights progressed on throughout the entirety of the show, it was kind of like we got a sneak peek as to what COVID would look like, because each fight was filmed and fought at the training center for the Ultimate Fighter, and you got to hear every punch, every kick, every knee. You got to hear someone gurgling on their own spit as they were getting choked out by a guillotine or rear naked choke. It was absolute madness and unlike anything anyone has ever seen in the mid-2000s. Then would come the night that would change the UFC forever. Diego Sanchez won his fight to win the six-figure contract. Then came one of the greatest fights in UFC history that would change the sport forever between Forrest Griffin and Stephan Bonnar. This was toe-to-toe, probably the greatest fight of 2005, and it happened 20 years ago today. These two white boys were fighting over the last Miller Lite in the freezer at the barbecue. It was absolute madness, with Forrest Griffin coming out as the winner. But Dana White was feeling so generous because the fight was so great, he pulled something way out of left field.
Frank, Lorenzo, and I have gotten together and we've decided there is no loser in this fight. And we're going to offer Stephan Bonnar a six-figure contract with the UFC.
Basically, you fight your way in the quarterfinals, then you fight in the semifinals, then you fight in the finale, which the winner of the fight will get a six-figure contract with the UFC, guaranteed. And the loser sometimes would get a contract. We've seen guys like TJ Dillashaw that lost in the finale but went on to have very successful careers in the UFC. Since then, anyone and everyone who was famous in the UFC coached the Ultimate Fighter. Conor McGregor, Brock Lesnar, Ronda Rousey, Miesha Tate. Women were on the Ultimate Fighter. And now coming up with Daniel Cormier and Chael Sonnen. This was truly the show that saved the UFC. I straight up grew up watching this show. This dropped when I was almost 5 years old, and literally as I went on DVDs, yes, they were on DVD, I was watching. Matter of fact, I just rewatched the entire season over the past few months, and that was the inspiration of this video. My top 3 favorite seasons are probably Tough 17, John Jones, Chael Sonnen, Season 22, Conor McGregor, Uriah Faber, and probably the season of the guys in which I have their jersey, Rashad Evans, Rampage Jackson. Season 10, we all know fan favorites from there, Kimbo Slice, RIP, Brendan Schaub, the greatest comedian of all time. And we've seen many other aspects of the Ultimate Fighter grow. We saw a US versus UK season with Dan Henderson and Michael Bisping. We saw a Tough Smashes that was basically Team Australia versus Team London, coached by George Soteropoulos, who only hardcores know who he is, and Ross Pearson, who only hardcores know who he is. We've also seen Tough Latin America with Cain Velasquez and Fabricio Verdum as the coaches. Tough Brazil with Vitor Belfort, Vanderlei Silva as the coaches, Nogueira and Fabricio Verdum as the coaches. We've also seen Tough Brazil where Vanderlei Silva and Chael Sonnen, when they had that crazy brawl on set. The Ultimate Fighter has brought some of the best moments in the UFC. Who can forget Julian Lane, Let me bang, bro. Let me fucking bang. Absolute madness. This show was the best thing that ever happened to the UFC, and it may not get the views that it once had, but I'm just so happy and blessed to be able to be talking about this sport, and I'm so happy I grew up at a time when this show was peak MMA.
It's my way and no other way. End of story.